In 1961, the Soviet Union built a bomb so powerful that engineers had to redesign the plane meant to carry it, because no aircraft could survive dropping it and escaping in time. That bomb detonated once, over the Arctic, and then it was gone. But it was not the only weapon the USSR built and then quietly walked away from. Some were buried in the desert. Some were sunk at sea. Some were switched on, and according to the people who built them, never switched off. There is not a full record of what the USSR truly left behind, but these are the ones we know of. The bomb was called the Tsar Bomba, and it remains the most powerful explosive device ever detonated by a human being. It was built for one specific moment, a demonstration of Soviet power, timed to coincide with a Communist Party Congress, meant to remind the world exactly who held the largest weapon on Earth. It was not built to be used in war. It was built to be seen from very far away. The bomb weighed around 27 tons, so heavy that a specially modified long-range bomber had to carry it partly exposed beneath the fuselage, since no bay could fully enclose it. It was released by parachute, giving the crew a narrow window to fly clear before detonation, and their odds of survival were something Soviet engineers had to calculate in advance, not simply assume. The strange part is what the Soviets chose not to do with it. The bomb's actual design was capable of a far higher yield than what was tested. Soviet scientists, including physicist Andrei Sakharov, deliberately reduced the power before detonation, because even they considered the full version too dangerous to unleash, even in a controlled test over their own remote testing ground at Novaya Zemlya. They built the most destructive weapon in human history and then made it slightly less destructive on purpose because the original version frightened its own creators. Even scaled down, the detonation still produced a shockwave that reportedly circled the globe multiple times and a fireball visible from hundreds of miles away. The device that exploded that day no longer exists. It was consumed entirely in its own detonation, vaporized into the fireball it created. What survives instead is a replica, built decades later and now on display in the Nuclear Weapons Museum in Sarov, a city so secretive during the Soviet period that it did not officially appear on maps and was known instead by a numbered designation. The single most powerful weapon the USSR ever built now exists only as a hollow shell in a glass case, guarded not by soldiers, but by museum staff. A bomb that vanished in its own explosion is one kind of danger. A system built specifically to survive after everyone who might use it is already dead is something else entirely. That system is called perimeter, though in the West, it earned a more chilling nickname, dead hand. It was developed in the early 1980s, at a moment when Soviet military planners feared a sudden, overwhelming first strike could kill the entire chain of command before any retaliation order could be given. Their solution was to remove the requirement for a living commander altogether. Perimeter was built to detect signs of a nuclear strike, using a network of sensors monitoring for blast, seismic activity, and radiation, and under specific automated conditions, it could authorize a retaliatory launch on its own, with minimal human involvement at the final stage. Every nuclear doctrine on Earth assumes someone is alive to make the final call. Perimeter was engineered around the opposite assumption. For years after the Soviet collapse, its existence was neither confirmed nor denied by Russian officials, surfacing mostly through Western reporting and later a definitive account by journalist David Hoffman. Then, starting in 2011, retired senior commanders began stating publicly that the system remained on combat duty, and some have since claimed it was modernized with newer missile technology. Russia has never officially detailed its current status, so what's known comes largely from those individual statements rather than open confirmation. One of the system's own designers, Valery Yarenich, later described it publicly as having a dual purpose, guaranteeing retaliation, but also giving human leadership a reason to wait rather than launch immediately on the first hint of an attack, since the ability to strike back was no longer solely dependent on surviving the first minutes of a war. Even Cold War officers who helped design it have said its danger and its restraint were built from the same idea. Most Cold War hardware eventually became scrap, or a museum exhibit, or a punchline. This is one of the few systems that may still be exactly what it was built to be, switched on and waiting. If a bomb can disappear and a control system can outlive the empire that built it, what happens to something built to physically fight a war underwater for decades at a time? That question leads to the Typhoon-class submarines, the largest submarines ever constructed, nearly double the size of the largest submarine class the United States ever built. Each one stretched over 175 meters and could submerge to a displacement approaching 48,000 tons, carrying a crew of around 160. 6 of them were built at the Sevmash shipyard in Severodvinsk, based out of remote Arctic naval installations, designed to hide beneath the ice with enough firepower on board to guarantee a Soviet response even if every land-based missile silo had already been destroyed. These submarines were not defeated by any enemy. They were defeated by engineering progress. Newer, smaller, more efficient submarines eventually made the giant Typhoons obsolete, and most of the class was scrapped in the years after the Cold War ended, in some cases with financial assistance from the United States, a former enemy paying to help dismantle the weapons built to fight it. One submarine outlasted them all. The Dmitry Donskoy remained in active service for decades, used mainly for missile testing and ceremonial duties, until it was formally decommissioned in February 2023. Rather than being scrapped like its sister ships, Russian veterans groups successfully lobbied to preserve it, and it is expected to become a museum ship near the Central Naval Museum in St. Petersburg. A vessel built to disappear beneath the ice for the end of the world may soon sit quietly in a public harbor, close enough to photograph from a park bench. Of the 6 Typhoons ever built, most were dismantled in the 2000s and the 2010s, their reactors removed, and their hulls cut apart piece by piece at northern shipyards. A slow and expensive process compared to how quickly they had once been built. A 7th hull was laid down but scrapped before it was ever finished. A submarine that never even reached the sea it was designed to disappear into. A submarine that outlived its purpose is one kind of leftover. A weapon that was never decommissioned properly at all, simply buried and abandoned, is something far more unsettling. That brings the story to Vozrojdeniya Island, once one of the most isolated places on Earth, sitting in the middle of the Aral Sea. From 1948 into the early 1990s, this island served as the Soviet Union's primary open-air testing ground for weaponized pathogens, chosen specifically because its remoteness made accidental exposure to the outside world seem nearly impossible. A small settlement called Kantubek housed the scientists and soldiers who worked there, functioning almost like a hidden company town built entirely around the testing program. The program itself was a direct violation of the Biological Weapons Convention that the Soviet Union had signed in 1972. When the USSR collapsed in 1992, the site was abandoned in a hurry. Workers reportedly buried roughly 200 tons of anthrax slurry there rather than properly destroying it, sealing the evidence into the ground instead of eliminating it. Here's the part almost no one saw coming. Decades of Soviet irrigation projects had already been draining the rivers that fed the Aral Sea, and by the early 2000s, that same sea had shrunk so dramatically that the island stopped being an island. A land bridge formed, connecting what was supposed to be permanently isolated to the mainland itself. In 2002, the United States and Uzbekistan jointly carried out a decontamination effort on the site, though officials involved have said no one can be completely certain every buried agent was fully neutralized. The sea that was meant to guarantee this site's secrecy forever disappeared before the weapons buried inside it did. The testing there wasn't without consequence, even while it was still secret. In 1971, an accidental release from the island reportedly reached the nearby city of Aralsk, sickening several people and killing a small number of them, an incident the Soviet government kept concealed for decades afterward. It surfaced publicly only after Soviet defectors began describing the bioweapons program to Western intelligence in the early 1990s. Biological weapons were buried and left in the ground. Chemical weapons followed a stranger path, one hidden not by geography, but by decades of official denial. The Soviet Union ran one of the largest chemical weapons stockpiling programs in history, developed at closed military facilities, including the testing ground at Shikani, while simultaneously signing international agreements that restricted exactly that kind of program. The scale of what had actually been built stayed concealed for years, until defectors and later Russian whistleblowers began revealing stockpiles far larger than anything the government had ever declared. Russia eventually joined the Chemical Weapons Convention and reported completing destruction of its declared stockpile by 2017, a process overseen by international inspectors. But the story didn't end with that announcement. Western governments and independent researchers have continued to allege that undeclared chemical capability persisted afterward, pointing to poisoning incidents in the years since, including the 2018 case involving former intelligence officer Sergei Skripal in the United Kingdom, and the 2020 poisoning of opposition figure Alexei Navalny, both publicly attributed by Western governments to Russian state involvement, allegations Russia has denied. A treaty says the stockpile is gone. The allegations say otherwise. Outside a very small circle of people, nobody can say for certain which version is true. Weapons built to kill quietly are one kind of legacy. A hole blasted directly into the earth to prove a bomb could serve a peaceful purpose is a very different kind of strange. That hole exists in Kazakhstan, at the Semipalatinsk polygon, the Soviet Union's primary nuclear test site, where several hundred nuclear detonations took place between 1949 and 1989, close enough to populated areas that fallout regularly reached nearby towns and villages. One of those tests, conducted in 1965 and known as Chagin, was designed specifically to demonstrate a supposedly peaceful use for nuclear explosives, blasting out a reservoir where none had existed before. The resulting crater filled with water and became known, with unsettling literalness, as the Atomic Lake. Soviet officials reportedly swam and fished there themselves, intended as proof the water was safe. Testing at the site continued for decades, with limited regard for the communities living nearby, and the health consequences for residents of the surrounding region have been documented for generations since. The peaceful framing of the Chagin test has been widely disputed by public health researchers ever since. Testing finally ended in 1989, driven in large part by a sustained public protest movement known as Nevada Semipalatinsk, and the site closed formally in 1991. Portions of the former polygon remain restricted or monitored for residual contamination today, and Chagin Lake itself is documented in both Soviet-era and later Kazakh sources as radioactive. A hole blown into the ground to prove a bomb could be useful became one of the most quietly radioactive lakes on the planet. A crater, at least, is a marked and known danger. The strangest leftover weapons of all are the ones nobody ever marked. Scattered across the Soviet Arctic coastline are hundreds of small, sealed metal cylinders, each about the size of a barrel, each capable of delivering a lethal dose of radiation to anyone curious enough to pry one open. These are radioisotope thermoelectric generators, deployed by the Soviet Union to power unmanned lighthouses and navigation beacons in places so remote that sending a technician to maintain a normal power source wasn't realistic. Instead, engineers relied on the steady decay of radioactive material inside a sealed container, a maintenance-free power supply that could theoretically keep working for years without a single human visit. After the Soviet Union collapsed, the tracking and maintenance programs behind these devices broke down along with everything else. Some units simply became unaccounted for. Scrap metal collectors, unaware of what they had found, stripped others for parts, sometimes selling the metal casings without any idea of what had been sealed inside. International recovery efforts, including cooperation between Russia, the United States, and Norway under joint threat reduction programs, have since located and secured a large number of these generators, though officials involved have acknowledged that not every unit has been recovered. In 2001, in the Republic of Georgia, a group of woodcutters found one such generator abandoned in the forest and suffered severe radiation injuries after handling it, unaware of what they had stumbled onto. It had been sitting there, unguarded, for years before anyone found it, powering nothing, warming the surrounding snow with its own decay heat, which is reportedly what drew the woodcutters close enough to pick it up in the first place. The Soviet Union didn't only build weapons capable of ending the world, it scattered smaller radioactive devices across an entire coastline, and then simply stopped keeping track of where they were. A bomb replica sits behind glass in a city that once refused to exist on any map. A command system built to outlive its own commanders may still be switched on tonight. The strangest part is not any single object. It's how many different forms this leftover danger has taken. A treaty, a lake, a rusted hull, an unmarked cylinder in the snow, as if one collapsed ideology scattered its evidence across every category of catastrophe it could reach. Somewhere along thousands of miles of Arctic coastline, one of those sealed containers may still be sitting exactly where it was left decades ago, uncatalogued, unguarded, waiting for someone who has no idea what they're about to find. The ideology that built all of this collapsed decades ago. The weapons, in one form or another, did not.